There have been some other events that I want to make sure you all are aware of. I'm sure you probably are familiar with some of the things we announced back in February. In particular, new information that we have supplied on the state of broadband availability and adoption here in the United States. So in February, on time and under budget, which is one of our favorite phrases, we did release the National Broadband Map, and I hope all of you have had a chance to play with it and take a look at the capabilities and the functionality that it provides. We have data in this map from 1,650 unique broadband providers, all of whom supplied information to the states who had the lead role to collect and verify this data before sending it in to us. At 25 million separate data points in this map. And again, when you go online and bring up the interface to type in your address or whatever, you really have no sense of the complexity and the volume of information that informs the map and the database. And of course, it's by far the most detailed and granular set of data ever collected on broadband availability in the United States. And it's just our first try. We're going to continue to update it twice a year, and we'll continue to find refinements and make improvements where we can make them as we get more and more experience with the data we're collecting and the information we're having. Part of the nice features of the map include a crowdsourcing function so that people can actually come on and provide us direct information about the availability of broadband at their own house or business and other information, so that we'll have that information to provide back to the states to help them improve their data collection efforts. So we think of it as an ongoing process to maintain and improve a database of broadband information. And while they're nice maps you can go look at, the real power of this tool is in all of the data that's available, and it's totally open. Anybody can download all 25 million data points and do whatever analysis they want to do with it. And I understand people have tried. I don't know how many, I don't know exactly how big a hard drive you need to have to download the whole map, but I'm sure it's a daunting exercise, but people are doing it, and absolutely that's part of the Obama Open Government Initiative, is to get this data out to anybody who can make use of it and find interesting conclusions, analyses that we just don't have the time or resources to do, but it's now open to anybody in the country to take that task on, and we certainly are encouraging that. So what does the map show? It's just some high-level data to pass on to you if you're not already familiar with some of the conclusions you can draw from the map. When we released it, we announced that it showed that 5 to 10% of Americans lack access to broadband internet. All right, so you collected 25 million data points and you can't be any more specific than 5 to 10%, but there's actually a reason for that. We're basing that on the FCC's standard of 4 megabits per second download, 1 megabit per second upload speed, which was a conclusion they reached in the National Broadband Plan in terms of what actual speeds are necessary for a user to basically make use of a basic set of internet applications. But that's actual speeds people have. We collected of what was advertised speed information. And not only that, but the categories we collected it in were like 1 to 3 megabits per second, and 3 to 6 megabits per second, and 6 to 12 megabits per second. So we don't actually have the exact data to match up with the FCC standard of actual speed. So the best we could do was kind of bracket the 4 megabit download, 1 megabit upload with our data of availability in the 3 to 6 range and the 6 to 12 range, and that's where we get the 5 to 10% figure from. So it's quite specific, but it's somewhat, it sounds non-specific just because of the difference in the data collection. But still, I think it gives a good representation of what the issue is we're dealing with in terms of still building out broadband services across the country. We took a look at wireless specifically, and what we found there, again, based on the advertised speeds of the carriers, that about 95% of Americans can get access to 3G wireless, which basically is defined at anything above 768 kilobits per second. So again, doesn't match the FCC test, but it gives you a sense of what's available. When you look at 4G, and there we used a surrogate of about 6 megabits per second, what we find is that about 35–36% of Americans have access to 4G wireless today. And as you probably are aware from the President's National Wireless Initiative, we're hoping to make an investment in unserved areas to expand 4G wireless broadband through appropriation of approximately $5 billion that would be given to the FCC to manage as part of the universal service funding. So, so there's still some hope to the extent that the market doesn't deliver these 4G build-outs, that we can focus on the truly unserved areas with wireless build-outs to expand availability there. We took a hard look at anchors as part of the map. In fact, we collected data from several 100,000 anchor institutions, and there we're looking at actual speeds. The anchors were asked to report what are they actually subscribing to. And the information there, I think, points out what everyone in this room knows. Anchors are underserved in this country. Even in areas where there may be a consumer offering of 1.5–3 megabits per second service, that does not meet the needs of anchor institutions. I know some of the work that the state education technology officers have done suggests that a school needs roughly 100 megabits per second for every 1,000 students. So when you start to think about an average school size, you can see that we are probably looking at minimum speeds for schools in the 50 to 100 megabits per second range. What we found was even at 25 megabits per second, 2/3 of schools are subscribing to speeds slower than 25 megabits per second. And when you get to the libraries, the picture is even bleaker because 96% of libraries that reported data to us indicated they're subscribing at speeds less than 25 megabits per second. So it's very clear that when we look at broadband, we really have to analyze these markets separately for anchor institutions than from mass market consumer services, and we see we still have a long way to go to meet the needs of anchor institutions. So as I said, we'll be updating this map twice a year, and through the efforts of the states. I think they're collecting data right now on end of year 2010 information, which they'll be supplying to us and which we hope to have up on the updated map sometime later this summer. So be watching for that. On the same day that we released the broadband map in February, we also released new data from our annual census survey. And this focuses on broadband adoption in the country in terms of who's actually subscribing to broadband. So the census, again, this is the largest data collection effort of its kind in the area of broadband. Other groups like Pew and FCC have done telephonic surveys, and our information and our conclusions are very similar to theirs. But we actually surveyed 54,000 families, which means it's over 130,000 individuals that we're collecting data from. So it gives us a chance to break data down by state and do a lot more deep data analysis on various demographic factors and ethnicity of respondents, that sort of thing. So the February report is our preliminary data, and then we'll be doing a much deeper analysis that should be released before the end of the year, and then we'll repeat the cycle and survey people again in October to collect the data that we'll report out next year. So what does this data show? It shows that in the year between 2010, we did see an increase in the adoption of broadband services. And what this means is how many people are now subscribing at home to broadband. And so the rate of adoption grew to 68% last year, up from 63.5% in 2009. So we have a 4.5–5 percentage point increase, which I think when you consider how difficult a year economically we had last year, I think that's a pretty good outcome. But we're still only at 68%. So we know 90 to 95% could subscribe to it, but only 68% do. We also see that there's a urban-rural gap. The good news is the gap is closing. In this year, we showed that about 70% of urban households subscribe to broadband, 60% rural. It's a 10% gap. Last year, the gap was 12%. So the rural areas are starting to catch up a little bit, and that's the good news that we're seeing. But on the other hand, we still see a 10 percentage point gap between subscription in urban and rural areas. We see a tremendous amount of variation across states. So Utah in the survey came out the highest with about an 80% adoption rate. At the other end was Mississippi at 52%. So, you know, that's quite a range, 30 percentage points difference between the state with the highest adoption and the state with the lowest adoption. So it does, again, point out that some strategies that certainly we were thinking about as we awarded grants are going to be important in terms of improving broadband availability in some of these states. We still see gaps in terms of race and ethnicity. So in the Hispanic community, they're showing a 45% adoption rate. Again, national average 68%, Hispanics at 45%. Good news is that they actually had a higher increase last year than the national average. They had a 5.5 percentage point increase against the 4.5 percentage point increase we saw nationally. Among blacks, the adoption rate's a little higher. It's at 50%, but the increase year over year was only 4 percentage points between 2009 and 2010. So again, it shows we have work to do there, and certainly our strategy on our sustainable broadband adoption projects has been to identify projects where the researchers and the providers are focused on particular communities in terms of trying to understand better the reasons for non-adoption in some of these communities and figure out what strategies are going to work the best in those communities in terms of encouraging adoption. And of course that takes us to kind of the last major